From the first months of the Second World War, airmen learned a truth that would shape every decision they made in the sky. No matter how advanced the aircraft, how experienced the pilot, or how carefully the mission was planned, survival remained uncertain with every turn of the propeller. Across Europe's airfields, thousands of crews climbed into machines built under urgent pressure, knowing each flight would test both their training and their endurance. They left behind barracks filled with silence, workshops lit through the night, and runways stained by the weight of returning steel. Many would not come home. The ones who did carried with them stories carved into metal and memory. Among these stories, some remained barely spoken, whispered with restraint, remembered with quiet reverence. They were the stories of aircraft that returned in states no engineer had anticipated, machines that should not have stayed aloft, flown by men who refused to surrender control even when structure failed beneath their hands. These returns became more than footnotes in combat reports, they became testament to the extremes of discipline and determination. The image of a pilot bringing his aircraft home after losing much of a wing endures as one of the most solemn truths of the air war, a moment in which destruction, duty, and survival converged in fragile balance. It is not a tale of spectacle, but of endurance in the face of collapse, of a damaged machine fighting gravity, and of a human being refusing to abandon the path home. During the Second World War, military aviation evolved from a relatively new tactical instrument into a decisive force shaping the outcome of entire campaigns, and in this process, countless men were asked to fly machines that were imperfect, unreliable, constantly improved under the pressures of combat, and pushed to their physical and mechanical limits. Aircrew confronted not only the enemy before them, but gravity, weather, fatigue, and the inherent fragility of aircraft built rapidly, often under strict material constraints. Within this history emerged stories of returns that seemed impossible, of machines that, by technical reasoning, should not have remained aloft, and yet did. Among these accounts, the story of the pilot who brought his aircraft home despite the loss of a wing stands as a testament to determination, discipline, and the collective effort of those who maintained, supported, and flew the aircraft entrusted to them, and to the resilience of the men who bore the weight of the war in the skies. The air war in Europe demanded constant operational readiness from pilots and crews stationed in remote or hastily prepared airfields. Many of these bases transformed from quiet farmland into centers of international military activity in only a matter of months. Hangars rose alongside improvised workshops, while fuel depots, barracks, intelligence offices, and emergency medical facilities were placed according to immediate need. The logistics supporting a single squadron required the labor of hundreds of individuals, from ground crews working through cold and rain to ensure aircraft could reach operational altitude, to meteorologists who understood that high clouds could determine the lives of dozens, to armorers preparing ammunition whose reliability could never be taken for granted. At every level, precision and endurance were essential, and mistakes could echo through multiple missions and cost multiple lives. Aircraft returned damaged on a daily basis, their fuselages torn by flak, their engines pushed far beyond intended tolerances, their airframes stressed by sudden evasive dives or the turbulent weather of the North Atlantic and the European continent. The engineering behind these machines anticipated a wide range of stressors, but war invariably exceeded expectations. Combat reports documented aircraft returning with elevators held by a single hinge, engines without oil pressure, hydraulic systems entirely failed, and landing gear locked in place or dangling freely. Crews described vibrations so violent that instruments became unreadable, oxygen shortages that threatened consciousness at altitude, fuel leaks that transformed every minute into a calculation of range and possibility. Each successful return represented not only individual competence but the shared training, discipline, and preparation of entire units functioning under exhausting pressure. Within this context, the return of a pilot without a wing must be understood not as a miraculous event detached from reality, but as part of a continuum of extraordinary efforts undertaken by aviators who faced every imaginable type of damage. In the vocabulary of pilots and engineers, the term, without a wing, could indicate the loss of a substantial section of lifting surface, a catastrophic structural failure, the shearing away of aerofoil material due to collision, enemy fire, or mid-air contact, or the collapse of the main spar within the wing structure. In aerial combat, fragmentation from anti-aircraft shells often tore through aluminum skin, severed control surfaces, or ruptured internal support members. Fighters and bombers might return missing wingtips, flaps, ailerons, and large sections of outer wing structure, each of which dramatically reduced lift on that wing, demanded constant correction with rudder and elevator input, and strained the surviving engines. Pilots in such conditions relied on experience and instinct developed through rigorous training, often aware that a single misjudged movement or a momentary lapse in concentration could result in uncontrollable roll and descent. When aircraft were struck by anti-aircraft artillery, the resulting damage could exceed the imagination of spectators on the ground. Veterans recalled aircraft landing with torn metal edges fluttering violently in the slipstream, fuel spewing from ruptured tanks, and entire structural elements burnt or shattered. The unpredictable distribution of damage meant that two airframes subjected to nearly identical impacts could experience entirely different fates, one spiraling downward rapidly while the other remained marginally controllable. The return of an aircraft with half of its wing compromised tested the boundaries of aerodynamic stability, forcing the pilot to compensate through constant lateral correction, and requiring both unyielding concentration and a profound understanding of the machine's remaining capabilities. Yet documented wartime experience demonstrates that some aircraft, particularly those with robust internal structures, could retain partial airworthiness under shocking physical loss. The emotional burden placed on pilots in such circumstances extended beyond the immediate physical challenge of flight. These aviators carried the memory of losses they had witnessed, fellow pilots who had vanished over the sea, and missions that ended abruptly in clouds of fire or debris. The moment of structural failure aboard an aircraft was rarely a singular, isolated shock. It was accompanied by the awareness of earlier departures that never concluded in safe landings, and by the knowledge that their own return could not be guaranteed. Many airfields maintained silent lists of missing crews, updated frequently, sometimes daily. Behind each line stood families, comrades, instructors, and ground personnel who had shared daily routines, meals, and the fragile normalcy created between missions. For a pilot to maintain composure while flying a critically damaged aircraft required extraordinary internal stability and a focus strengthened by habit, duty, and the collective trust of those who depended on him. The airbases themselves changed in response to these experiences. Maintenance personnel documented damage patterns meticulously, identifying vulnerable components and reinforcing them where possible. Field modifications, sometimes improvised with remarkable ingenuity, extended survivability, including armor plating installed around critical systems, reinforcement of spars, and adjustments to engine mounts. Pilots were instructed in emergency procedures that prioritized stability over speed, continuous trimming under asymmetric load, and approaches designed to minimize lateral stress during landing. These adaptations arose not from abstract planning but from the lived reality of pilots returning with machines that defied expectation. The shared desire to save lives drove rapid innovation, informed by technical knowledge and the hard lessons of combat. Stories of pilots returning with catastrophic damage spread cautiously through units, often initially through maintenance crews tasked with assessing the extent of structural loss. These crews examined airframes that should not have landed intact, observing fractures along the main spar, the absence of significant lifting surfaces, and control cables worn through by repeated high-force input. Each inspection contributed to a growing understanding of what aircraft could endure under extreme circumstances, and these lessons informed both tactical planning and the collective confidence of airmen. The respect accorded to such returns reflected not only admiration for piloting skill, but also an acknowledgement of the unpredictable nature of survival in the air war. For a pilot to lose a substantial portion of a wing in flight, multiple conditions had to coincide. The aircraft had to sustain damage severe enough to remove structural material, yet retain enough control authority to avoid immediate roll into unrecoverable descent. The pilot had to have the discipline to avoid overcorrection, which could widen the damage or impose new structural failure, and the alertness to monitor engine temperatures, control surface response, and altitude constantly. Fuel imbalances, common when tanks were breached or venting fuel, worsened asymmetry, forcing the pilot to adjust trim continually. The combination of these stressors produced a level of fatigue difficult to describe and nearly impossible for those outside aviation combat to fully comprehend. Survival depended not merely on instinct, but on training reinforced through repetition, drilled into muscle memory during long months of preparation. As aircraft approached their home base in such conditions, the tension on the ground intensified. Ground crews could often identify returning aircraft long before they landed, observing smoke trails, damaged silhouettes, or asymmetrical flight patterns that signaled catastrophe narrowly avoided. Medical teams waited beside runways, fire crews positioned themselves strategically, and officers prepared for the possibility of crash landing or sudden loss of power. These moments condensed the uncertainty of war into a fragile interval defined by speed, altitude, and the fragile connection between machine and human intent. When an aircraft landed in such a state, relief spread across the base quietly but unmistakably, though always shadowed by the knowledge that the next mission could demand an equally high cost. Pilots who survived such experiences often avoided dramatic recounting of their ordeal. Their narratives were shaped by modesty, by the recognition of luck, and by the profound respect they held for those who had not returned. Instead of triumphalism, their recollections conveyed restraint, gratitude, and a sober awareness of the war's unpredictability. Veterans described the sensation not as heroic achievement, but as fulfillment of duty and the convergence of factors beyond their individual control: training, engineering, teamwork, weather, and fortune. This humility unified airmen across nations and units, reflecting a shared understanding forged in continuous exposure to danger. Mechanics, armorers, and technicians approached such damaged aircraft with reverence, fully aware that their work contributed to the survival of crews on every mission. They documented fractures, measured the extent of material loss, and noted stress patterns that revealed the forces involved. Their reports informed engineers and manufacturers, shaping the evolution of aircraft designs during the war. Each structural anomaly became evidence of the war's intensity and the machine's capabilities. The presence of an aircraft that had been flown home despite the loss of a wing became a tangible symbol of perseverance, reminding all who saw it that survival was possible even under the direst conditions. In squadron histories, such events served a dual purpose: preserving the memory of extraordinary returns while honoring the broader sacrifices inherent in aerial warfare. These accounts highlighted the resilience of individuals while acknowledging the collective effort required for survival. They reinforced morale not through sensationalism, but through recognition of skill, preparation, and mutual support. They underscored the message that even when circumstances appeared beyond recovery, disciplined effort and adherence to training could offer a path to safety. For pilots, the memory of flying a crippled aircraft often resurfaced long after the war. Veterans reported recalling the vibrations, the smell of burning fuel, the continuous struggle against aerodynamic imbalance, and the overwhelming silence that followed landing. The emotions attached to these moments persisted, shaped by recognition of loss and survival intertwined. Such memories influenced their lives after the war, fostering gratitude, humility, and at times, an enduring heaviness that proved difficult to articulate. The story of the pilot who returned without a wing, therefore, belongs not only to the individual aviator, but to every mechanic who tightened a bolt under freezing rain, every crew chief who inspected control systems late into the night, every nurse who prepared for incoming casualties, every intelligence officer who reviewed reconnaissance photographs, and every family who waited for news. It stands as a reminder that the survival of one pilot represented the labor, courage, and sacrifice of many. As operations intensified during the middle years of the war, the margin between mission success and irreversible loss narrowed further, and the frequency of catastrophic damage increased proportionally to the growing scale of aerial engagement. Squadrons rotated between offensive and defensive tasks with little time to recover, absorbing the strain of continuous missions through a combination of discipline and necessity. Maintenance cycles accelerated in response to attrition, and airmen learned to recognize subtle mechanical cues that could indicate structural compromise even before visible signs emerged. Reports from returning aircraft showed patterns of stress concentration near wing routes, particularly after repeated high-G maneuvers, abrupt evasive dives, or prolonged exposure to turbulent cloud columns. Engineers analyzed these findings, correlating them with the aerodynamic demands of the operational environment, seeking methods to preserve integrity for longer periods despite the inevitability of combat-induced corrosion and fatigue. In this environment, aviators became acutely aware of the fragility inherent in every sortie, and yet they continued to fly. The cumulative weight of operational duty filtered into the mindset of each pilot, shaping an internal equilibrium between caution and confidence. The uncertainty surrounding each mission, especially those involving deep penetration into hostile airspace, underscored the significance of adherence to formation discipline, fuel management, and navigation precision. As air battles expanded in scope, pilots encountered dense flak corridors, interceptor waves timed with tactical precision, and meteorological challenges that obscured visibility and forced instruments to the forefront of survival. Each variable introduced new hazards, adding layers of complexity to already demanding missions. Returning with severe structural loss required not only technical skill, but the psychological steadiness to resist panic when the aircraft reacted unpredictably. When a wing was damaged, the pilot confronted a relentless physical asymmetry, one that magnified turbulence and transformed ordinary control inputs into delicate calibration. Veterans recalled that the awareness of structural instability altered every perception in the cockpit. The sound of rushing wind grew louder as exposed internal surfaces fluttered in the slipstream, vibrations propagated through the airframe as irregular oscillations, and the instrument panel conveyed fluctuating readings that required continuous interpretation. A pilot who endured such conditions was forced to maintain an unwavering focus, mindful that overcompensation could inflict further strain on the surviving wing structure. At the same time, those stationed on the ground developed gestures of vigilance shaped by repetition. The sight of distant aircraft struggling to maintain level flight triggered an instinctive response among personnel responsible for emergency procedures. Ambulance crews placed themselves near predetermined positions, ground controllers monitored approach vectors with heightened attention, and fire response teams stood ready for the worst possible outcome. Though outwardly calm, each individual understood that a landing attempt under such conditions constituted the final test of training under pressure. The silence that enveloped the base at these moments signaled not only fear of loss, but collective respect for the pilot fighting unseen forces overhead. For the pilot, the runway represented both safety and danger. Approaching at the wrong angle or speed could push the airframe beyond its structural endurance, causing collapse during descent. Yet decreasing altitude reduced exposure to cold and oxygen deprivation, and offered the possibility of controlled impact rather than uncontrolled crash. These decisions took shape in seconds but reflected months, sometimes years, of instruction, experience, and observation. The final approach became a distillation of accumulated knowledge, demanding absolute composure and precision when physical exhaustion threatened clarity. When aircraft such as these finally made contact with the ground, the result varied. Some rolled to a stop with a solemn finality that belied the violence inflicted upon them. Others collapsed upon landing, absorbing the damage in chaotic but survivable motion. Ground crews documented every detail meticulously, mapping fracture points, material deformation, and component separation. Such examinations contributed not only to immediate tactical improvements, but to the collective memory of aviation units, preserving lessons that would inform future missions and safeguard lives. The pilot who returned with a missing wing segment often resisted the notion of exceptionalism, believing instead that circumstances, training, and teamwork converged at decisive moments. This perspective echoed throughout the narratives of war veterans, emphasizing that the endurance of one pilot reflected the shared strength of many unseen hands. The sense of solidarity forged among aircrews, ground personnel, and support staff sustained units through the most difficult periods of the war, reinforcing the understanding that survival was a communal achievement. The middle phase of the air war illustrated the extreme conditions aircrews endured and highlighted the evolving knowledge that made extraordinary returns feasible. It was a time defined by unrelenting operational rhythm, deepening awareness of mortality, and unwavering dedication to mission goals despite overwhelming obstacles. The airfields of this era became places where hope and loss intersected daily, where the return of a single damaged aircraft offered reassurance, and where the sight of a pilot stepping away from a crippled machine preserved morale even as war pressed onward. As the strategic momentum of the Second World War shifted decisively, the tempo of Allied air operations increased to a frequency and intensity unprecedented in aviation history. Airbases expanded beyond their original design, adapting under pressure to accommodate multiple squadrons, overlapping training cycles, and round-the-clock mission demands. What had once been temporary wartime installations evolved into self-contained logistical environments designed to sustain continuous flight activity with almost no interruption. In this environment, the endurance required of crews extended beyond flying skill. It demanded unbroken concentration, emotional steadiness, and the ability to confront daily uncertainty with unwavering discipline. Stories of survival under extreme structural damage, including the return of aircraft missing significant wing components, assumed profound significance within this framework, not as isolated incidents of improbable fortune, but as evidence of procedural rigor, teamwork, and resilience under overwhelming pressure. By late 1944 and into 1945, the scale of aerial deployment imposed new demands upon pilots at every level. They operated in skies thick with risk, dense concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery defended key industrial zones, frontline formations clashed over contested territory, and sudden weather shifts introduced additional layers of hazard. Aircraft returning under catastrophic damage conditions reflected these realities directly. Reports documented machines with large aerodynamic surfaces torn away, with spar fractures extending through primary load-bearing structures, with outer wing sections sheared off entirely. Pilots forced to fly such aircraft encountered a relentless struggle against asymmetric forces, requiring constant rudder correction and precise trimming to prevent spiraling descent. Maintaining control under these circumstances required more than technical knowledge. It required composure developed through repetition and reinforced through training. Pilots learned to identify subtle aerodynamic cues, small deviations in yaw, fluctuating vibration patterns, unusual altitude loss rates, and translate them into corrective inputs. They understood that every movement of the aircraft carried consequences amplified by damage, and that sudden or excessive adjustments risked worsening structural failure. Their endurance under strain demonstrated the intersection between procedural discipline and lived experience. For ground crews, the return of such aircraft left deep impressions. Mechanics who inspected these machines confronted the physical reality of aerial warfare carved into metal. They examined shattered structural members, burned through rivet lines, and twisted alloy beams under floodlights in early morning hours. They discovered telltale signs of flak fragmentation, observed shock buckling along spar reinforcements, and documented the precise deformation patterns caused by aerodynamic stress. Their analyses refined the understanding of failure thresholds, informing maintenance protocols and retrofits. Engineering teams incorporated these findings rapidly, despite limited resources and compressed timelines. Field recommendations resulted in reinforcement of wing routes on several aircraft models, adjustments to the geometry of control cables, and improved distribution of hydraulic circuitry to provide additional redundancy. These engineering changes reflected the direct influence of survivals achieved under catastrophic damage. In this sense, the pilot who returned missing major wing structure contributed not only as a survivor, but as a catalyst for technical evolution. On the operational level, intelligence officers adjusted mission planning based on evidence gathered from damaged aircraft. They identified specific flak concentrations capable of producing catastrophic structural loss, adjusting flight paths and altitude recommendations accordingly. They studied the conditions that differentiated survivable damage from fatal failure, noting the influence of wind direction, formation spacing, and entry vector into high-risk zones. These analyses strengthened operational resilience, using knowledge paid for in blood and sacrifice. Yet parallel to the technical dimension ran a profound emotional current. As losses mounted over years of combat, surviving pilots bore memories that became part of the war's internal landscape. Those who returned after catastrophic damage carried the psychological weight of both relief and responsibility. Their landings were not greeted with spectacle, but with solemn respect. They knew all too well that for every pilot who returned in such condition, others had not. This awareness shaped how they remembered their experiences, quietly, without embellishment, and with humility rooted in grief as much as gratitude. The airfields themselves became repositories of unspoken memory. Barracks accommodated empty beds that would not be reassigned. Mess tables retained seats permanently vacant. Hangars preserved silence around aircraft that would never fly again. The return of a pilot under catastrophic structural loss stood in silent contrast against the absence left behind by those who never returned at all. In the late phase of the war, this dynamic intensified. The closer the conflict approached its end, the heavier the emotional burden became for those still flying. Veterans later reflected that the final months were psychologically more complex than earlier stages, not because danger increased, but because the accumulation of loss had reached its deepest point. The knowledge that peace approached did not diminish the threat faced on every flight, it magnified the urgency of survival. In this context, every safe landing of a damaged aircraft carried immense symbolic weight. It reminded those present that hope could persist even under crippling circumstances. That return was possible despite overwhelming odds. That discipline could overcome mechanical destruction. That exhaustion could give way to endurance. And that community, not the individual alone, sustained life in the sky. As the final operational months unfolded, the rhythm of military aviation entered a new and unfamiliar phase. The immense pressure of years of constant flight began to collide with the first emerging signs of approaching victory. Yet for the pilots and crews whose duties still required them to fly daily missions, the reality remained unchanged. Every aircraft that left the ground entered airspace where danger persisted without compromise. In these conditions, the return of an aircraft that had suffered catastrophic structural failure spoke to something deeper than technical possibility. It embodied the shared belief that survival must be pursued until the very last flight was completed, regardless of how near the war appeared to its close. The emotional landscape across airfields deepened with every passing week. Pilots continued flying with the knowledge that peace might lie just beyond the horizon, yet they also recognized that the conflict would not truly end until the guns fell silent everywhere. For them, each mission represented a test of endurance not only against enemy fire, but against the weight of accumulated memory. The aircraft that returned under devastating structural loss became symbols of that tension between proximity to peace and persistence of risk. When such an aircraft appeared on final approach, listing, unstable, visibly shattered, the entire airbase responded with a shared attentiveness born of experience. Emergency crews coordinated positions, fire teams identified potential hazards, medical personnel prepared for impact. And yet, beneath the procedural readiness lay a more profound sentiment, a collective wish that the pilot might complete the journey home. Observers understood that the outcome was uncertain until the wheels touched the ground and the machine came to rest. When the aircraft finally landed, often skidding unevenly, sometimes collapsing under its own weakened structure, there was no applause, no spectacle, no outward celebration. Instead, silence prevailed. The pilots emerging from such machines carried an exhaustion that spoke not of triumph, but of survival against all reasonable expectation. They walked with the knowledge that their return had depended upon more than their own actions, upon ground crews who had prepared the aircraft, upon fellow aviators who had flown beside them, upon engineers whose designs had withstood forces beyond specification, upon medical staff who stood ready should the aircraft fail to land intact. In the weeks following the armistice, as the tempo of operations finally concluded, the remnants of the air war became visible in a new way. Aircraft that had borne the scars of catastrophic damage stood silently in long lines, waiting for decisions regarding their future. Some would be flown home under careful supervision, others would be dismantled where they stood. The stillness of these machines contrasted sharply with the violence they had endured, and in that contrast emerged a clarity that had been obscured during the urgency of combat. Veterans later spoke of those moments with a solemnity shaped by time. They recalled how, in the quiet after the war, memories of catastrophic return surfaced with greater weight than they had during battle. For many, the clearest memories were not of engagements or maneuvers, but of the sensations associated with trying to keep broken aircraft aloft, the pulsing vibration of unstable wings, the heavy pull of asymmetric lift, the sense of fighting gravity itself minute by minute. These memories did not fade, they became part of the inner landscape of those who carried them. Historians approached these stories with methodological care, recognizing that factual accuracy must coexist with emotional truth. They compared personal recollections with service logs, engineering reports, and mission summaries, constructing a documented understanding that honored both data and memory. From this work emerged the recognition that aircraft returning under catastrophic wing damage represented the convergence of structure, training, discipline, and collective support. They demonstrated that survivability was not accidental, but shaped by experience, ingenuity, and endurance. With the passing of time, museums and memorial institutions sought to preserve these narratives. Exhibits displayed damaged wing sections, annotated spar fragments, schematic diagrams detailing stress patterns, and photographs of returning aircraft bearing wounds across their flight surfaces. Visitors confronted these artifacts in silence, realizing that every fracture line represented a moment of decision, a contest between collapse and control, a measure of sacrifice beyond calculation. For the pilots themselves, the meaning of such a return expanded as decades went on. It became not simply a moment of individual survival, but a reflection of camaraderie, shared burden, and responsibility toward those who had not returned. The damaged aircraft symbolized the fragility of life in war and the strength found in collective purpose. Pilots came to understand that their own survival was inseparable from the memory of comrades who did not reach home. In this connection, they found humility, gratitude, and an enduring sense of stewardship over the past. In the end, the story of the pilot who returned without a wing stands not as myth, nor as miracle, but as testimony. It testifies to the resilience forged under unthinkable strain, to the knowledge refined through trial, to the endurance strengthened by grief, and to the profound human need to return home, even when the means appear insufficient. It reminds us that survival in war is seldom clean or certain. It teaches that strength is found not in invincibility, but in persistence through damage. It shows that a broken aircraft, held steady by steady hands, can still touch the ground in safety. And it honors, above all, those who never returned, whose absence gave weight to every landing that did. This is the inheritance carried forward by survivors. This is the memory etched into history. This is the truth preserved in silence. That even when the wing is gone, even when only fragments remain, the will to return home can still bear the weight of an entire generation.